Good afternoon, Year 8. We're just going to do a bit of general language work this afternoon. We don't often get to do what's known as parsing anymore, P-A-R-S-I-N-G, which is looking at language and how it works in particular settings. Some of you are probably thinking, "Oh no, boring lesson." We'll try our best to see how these sort of skills are relevant today. So I've called it lapping up the language, getting it right. The first thing you'll see there, of course, is your spelling test for this week. The usual thing goes, let's learn them while we're at home during the week, and then we'll test them on Friday. When I say test, it's basically, it's just a way for me and for you to see what strengths you have in spelling. Some of you really get into it, and others, of course, you have a bit of apprehension and anxiety about it. There's one of the words there. I don't think you should have. It's just a way of us, it's a key to us unlocking your potential as spellers. And really, in English, it really is necessary because we've got so many homophones, words that sound the same, and we need to be able to distinguish those spellings. In other countries, of course, where they speak phonetically, for example, Italy, they won't need to have as much focus on something like spelling. It's just, know how to write the word. We have to be able to differentiate. I'll just go through these spelling words for this week so that you know exactly what you're doing. So the first one is litany. Oops, a daisy. Litany. A litany is basically just a long list of ideas, which is usually said in church contexts. So you might have a litany of the saints, where you say the name of the saint, then pray for us, and it's usually at around this time of the year in the Catholic Church, I think, around the time of Easter. So a litany. It can also be used disparagingly to say, "Oh, look, it was just a litany of complaints." On and on and on it went. The next one is antagonism. Antagonism means to go up against something. If you're an antagonist, you're the main counter character in a work of fiction, for example. The main person is known as the protagonist. The antagonist is someone who is up against him. Not necessarily a bad person. That's an antagonist. And antagonism is the noun, which means being counter to, or an enemy of, or a foe against something else or someone else. The next word, apprehension, used to mean in medieval times, and probably even up until the later 20th century, apprehension also stood for understanding. But what we've come to see it meaning is some form of anxiety or concern about something. You approach something with a sense of apprehension. Although I know that in Shakespeare's time, apprehension also meant understanding. So learn to spell those. Extremities, well, that shouldn't be too difficult, but all it means is something at the extreme. We have extremities on our body, our fingertips, our toes, our nose is an extremity. You can also use it in metaphorical conversations. Mate, you've gone to the extremities with that argument, or something like that. We have the extremities of the earth. If you go to the poles, you're at the extremes, etc. So you can see the word extreme being the root word there. Here's one that's often misused, two I should say, principal and principal. Well, the way that most kids learn it is that your principal, the fellow who's the boss at school, is your pal. Not necessarily, but that's the way you remember it. And principle is a notion or an idea or an ideal that you strive for. That's your principle. You don't want to work against your principles or your ideals. Principal and principle. Here's one that's slightly more difficult. You've got effect and affect. An effect is something that occurs as a result of your action. It's the effect of global warming. So it's basically an outward move. if you can, in terms of how I explain this, an effect is something that goes out. There's an effect, there's an action and a consequence, and then you have an effect. That's the way I remember it anyway. The other word is affect, of course, and the deal there is that it is inward. It's coming towards you. You are affected by something else. So if you describe someone as having become affected during as a result of an experience, that's how it works. So it's basically, this is towards a subject, the effect of something, and the affect is more inward, I suppose you could call it. That means that you are affected by something. So you can take on an affected way of walking or an affected way of speaking. It's just the way that you do those things. So the effect is kind of like a consequence or an effect, a consequence or of an action. And affect is the way that you have been made to look, feel, act as a result of some experience. It is the affect. All right, now these two words here are really interesting, extenuating and mitigating. You might often hear these words in courtroom dramas. You know, Your Honour, there are extenuating circumstances or there are mitigating factors. They both mean essentially the same thing. Extenuating factors, in a case, for example, may lead to the jury, the judge, understanding that you are not as much at fault as you could possibly be because there are extenuating circumstances beyond what we can see, and they help to mitigate against a longer sentence. So, for example, you know, you may be up for manslaughter, but there were mitigating circumstances. That is, that the person you hit with your car was drunk and moved out suddenly, you know, in a fit of drunken stupidity. So the mitigating circumstance there is that even though you have to be charged with manslaughter in that circumstance, you're not going to go to jail because the mitigating circumstances there were quite clear, and the extenuating circumstances too. All right, so look, it's just a spelling list. Let's work on that towards Friday, please. Okay. Here's something I like to do with all my students because it's necessary for you to know the difference between something which is a denotation, and here I am not working this properly, a denotation and a connotation. Essentially, a denotation is essentially what you'd see as the dictionary definition or the technical definition of something. The technical, and it's not letting me do this now, unfortunately. The technical, or almost the dictionary definition of a word. That's the denotation. Contrastingly, a connotation, which are usually more interesting for us in English, when we're looking at ideas and narratives, a connotation is a meaning based on experience, usually a personal experience, meaning based on experience. The example I like to give of denotation and connotation is, of course, the denotation of dog might be something like this. If you're looking at a denotation, this will probably be a bit hard to read, I suppose. So the denotation, which is the technical, the dictionary definition of something, the scientific idea behind that, might be, we'd call it quadruped, canine, mammal. What else could it be? Quadruped, canine, mammal. It's also a domesticated relative of the wolf. That's just off the top of my head, maybe other things as well. So the denotation of a dog would be, it's a quadruped, it's a canine, it's a mammal, it's a domesticated relative of the wolf. However, a connotation is going to be completely different. The connotation of the word dog is going to depend entirely on your experience with a dog. So, for example, you've got, I'll do it over here. I'll see if it'll let me write it over here. So if you're a postman, you're going to call a dog a vicious little mongrel. But if you're the owner of a pet store, you might call the dog a lovely companion pet for the lonely in our community. That's a valid connotation of that animal. So just remember that a denotation is a fairly technical differentiation, and a connotation is a meaning based on experience, usually personal experience. The last thing I want you to do today is to look at a poem and how to appreciate its use, the use of language, The Eagle by Alfred Lord Tennyson. I'm just setting you this up as classwork. You can listen to this via your headphones, your earphones, and then just do the work as required, just so that we start learning. Let's just go back to spelling. Can we make sure, please, to use each of these in a meaningful sentence and learn them for Friday's test, please. And also, if you don't mind, all of you, let's write out the dictionary definition. Dictionary definitions for each of these words today, please. Okay, the last thing you're doing is that we're going to read and look at the language of The Eagle by Alfred Lord Tennyson. It's a short poem, but let's get used to doing this because you're getting to the beauty of language, and also after that you're going to try your hand at writing a poem about an animal using the techniques displayed in The Eagle. Okay.